Well, hello to everyone tuning in on Zoom, and welcome back to Rabble's Off the Hill political panel. I'm Robin Browne, and I'm joining you as always from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And I'm joined tonight by my regular co-host, Libby Davies.
Well, thanks very much, Robin. Hello, everyone. I'm Libby Davies, and I'm joining you from the unceded traditional and ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coast Salish peoples.
All right. Well, we've come a long way since July 20, 2005, when Canada became the fourth country ever to legalize same-sex marriage nationwide. And we've still got a long way to go. For a moment, though, let's go back to 1988 and think about what it was like when former NDP MP Sven Robinson charted a new course by publicly coming out as gay. He received death threats and vandalism to his office. Sven is now writing a book on the historical injustices suffered by gays and lesbians in the military, federal public service, and the RCMP. There was finally a settlement of these wrongs by the federal government in 2018, and we'll touch on that a bit in our panel. So today we're talking about the challenges of the 2S LGBTQIA community that they still face, and in honor of Pride, also celebrating all that has been accomplished. So please welcome NDP MP Member of Parliament for Edmonton Griesbach Blake Desjarlais. Hi, Blake. Rabble columnist Charlotte Dalwood. Assistant Professor in the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Regina, Fritz Pino. Podcaster and Strategic Communications Executive Shawn Dearn, and Regional Director for the 2S LGBTQ+ Business Development in Quebec and Eastern Canada for TD Bank, Martine Roy. Welcome, everybody. Looking forward to a good discussion. And welcome to everyone joining us on Zoom. We encourage you to participate in the chat and polls and ask questions to our panelists through the Q&A function. And as always, we'll do our best to address your questions. Now, I'll pass it over to Libby to get us started.
Well, thanks very much, Robin. It's very exciting to have you all as guests tonight, especially as we are into Pride Month and various events across the country. So I'm going to begin actually with Shawn and Martine. And Shawn, first to you, as the creator and host of the podcast Queer Legends, which has been hugely successful, you discuss the many injustices towards the LGBT community by the federal government over many, many decades, including Canada's LGBT purge. So maybe just to start us off, can you give us a bit of history on what the LGBT purge is?
Well, that's a really long answer, but I'll try and squish it down to something more manageable. It started in 1948 when Canada created a new vetting process after the Second World War, and it was designed to get rid of communists everywhere in Canadian society. And it ended up going so well, according to government documents, that they ended up having to sort of move their gaze, if you'll pardon the pun, to somewhere else. And it was because they got so good at getting rid of communists that communists then started relying on things that were called sexual deviations or human weaknesses. And by that, they meant anyone who was gay or lesbian. And so what happened as a result of that, the Soviets and the spies and all the communists started going after gays and lesbians, trying to find all of their dirty secrets. But at the same time, the government started creating anti-gay policies, and they implemented these things. And what ended up happening, it was a brutal and violent witch hunt that basically started in 1948 and lasted right up until 1992-ish. A lot of people think that it kind of ended then, when in fact the documentary series that I put together for season 2 of Queer Legends really indicates that wasn't the case. And in fact, we had quite a lot of discrimination and homophobia continuing in the military, the RCMP, right up until the early 2000s. And so what happened, people lost their jobs. People were interrogated by the RCMP. If you could imagine, go to work, you're sitting at your desk doing your thing, and then all of a sudden two folks in suits appear next to you, and they're RCMP officers, and they take you off to some weird place you've never seen, usually a small house or a small office somewhere. There's egg cartons on the wall for sound, and a light hanging from the ceiling, and you were interrogated for hours and hours, and this would go on multiple times over multiple days even. And so, I mean, it's an ongoing injustice that lasted all that period of time. And finally, thanks to folks like Martine Roy, who you'll hear from in a second, they helped bring an apology, and there was an end to the purge, and policies began to change. But it's still an ongoing battle, as we're going to hear later today or in this show.
Well, Yeah, thank you so much, Shawn. First of all, that was an incredibly succinct history. And honestly, I think a history that a lot of Canadians don't know about. So the fact that you're doing your podcast and that there's information coming out through the Purge Fund and various projects is really fantastic, because it is exposing this incredible discrimination, and even people who took their own lives, right?
Yes,
I know there are stories of diplomats who took their own lives, or people in the military,
Yep.
because they were so persecuted. So yes, we're going to go to Martine next. And Martine, you're a survivor of the LGBT purge. And in 2016, you helped launch a nationwide class action lawsuit against the Canadian government. It was very successful. Maybe you could share a little bit of your experience about going through that lawsuit and getting to the point where there was an official apology. And if there's time to just tell us a little bit about the book that's being written that was mentioned by Sven, because I know it's a project of the Purge Fund, but we'd love to get a little sneak peek at a book that we know is going to come out.
Thank you. For sure. I don't have much information, though, about the book. He's keeping that pretty secret, I think, all along. But we did get a lot of archives to assist him. And that was one of our biggest points we did about the Purge Fund. But you have to understand that, like we said, in 92, they removed the policy, but they didn't change the culture. They didn't implement anything. So it really took 22 years before people got together and says, okay, we want to demand an apology. And it's really, we demand an apology that triggered in 2014. And we went in front of Parliament in 2015 to ask for an apology in that time, but nobody even talked about it. So it's when we joined the Just Society Committee and we decided to do a class action in 2016, that thing really concretized. We got a lawyer, we got law firm lawyer that got together. So we got 3 law firms that got together to represent us, 11 lawyers, and we went and negotiate. And it was like, for me, it was really important because, like you said, nobody heard about it. So it's almost, we did something really bad that was very discriminatory. It was misogyn because it was very a lot oriented towards the man in my time. And there was, and the woman, and there was not a lot of women, there were more men. So it left it, a lot of bad energy, of bad culture, and to all the federal agency. And until we talk about it, we cannot repair it. And that's the way I see it. So we're really into repairing by first admitting we did that and how we can change things and how we can change the culture, because it's really that. And they did put a culture department, but it's bigger than that. It's really something that everybody has to do. And at the end of the day, we're at work. You want you to be your authentic self because you want to be focused, right? So it's a very sad era, and it was very important for me to do something about it. I'm very grateful it worked. We did get some apology. We get some redress, like you said, the monument and all this. We get documentary like the fruit machine. There's another one. There's what Shawn did with the podcast. That's amazing, telling the story, the archive, and hopefully people's going to really talk about it, make sure we don't go back there.
Yes. Well, we certainly look forward to the book coming out, and I really encourage people to listen to Shawn's podcast, because they're quite incredible to hear the stories and to get this history out there and to hear what went on. So thank you for that, Martine.
Coincidentally, Martine's episode that she's in is out tomorrow afternoon. So if you're listening, you got 4 episodes to catch up on, and Martine comes out tomorrow.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you.
Actually, we're going to go to a question for Blake, although I've got a quick question of my own first, because as we know, Black federal employees have launched a class action suit against the government. So I'm just wondering, Martine, how long between launching your lawsuit and settling your lawsuit? How long was that?
It was pretty rapid. It's a kind of exceptional. It was an 11 months.
Okay.
Usually, it takes a lot less time, but right away people were ready to sit down. They were open about the conversation. And I think they understood by doing that, we were going to help the whole federal agency to change, because at the end of the day, the biggest company that we have in Canada is all those federal agencies. A lot of our friends, our people, sisters are working there, and things needed to change. So I know that it's the same thing as well for the Black community, and I'm supporting it, and I hope it's going to settle as soon as possible, the same way that we did.
Yeah, no, good to know that. Yeah, they've been going for 3 years now because they launched in December 2020. But Blake, as we've outlined, Canada's federal government has a mixed record on LGBTQ rights, often only upholding rights based on court challenges, right? Like we just heard, such as the same-sex marriage in 2005. How are queer rights being championed in Parliament today, and what are some of the key milestones and advances for the queer community that stand out for you?
Yeah, thanks for that question, and Tansei friends. It means a lot to be with all of you here today. It's not often, I think, that Indigenous voices, especially in the last 10 years, I think, have been within these spaces to speak to a really unique experience. And you spoke about some of the challenges, which is the legal system in combination with Canada's own treatment of the question of who is Canadian, who deserves rights in Canada. Indigenous people have been largely excluded from that history for most of our lives. And we know what it means when we have to take our rights to a court in order to enforce basic things like the rights to water, the rights to having a house, the rights to having equitable pay. That's similar to the Black class action lawsuit. There's actually an Indigenous class action lawsuit as well that was filed in 2021 with very similar claims of systemic racism. It's true that Canada has picked and choose who gets rights in Canada, and for the most part of Canada's history, it's largely been those of in terms of language rights, particularly French and English. We see a very strong protection of those languages, so much so that my first language, Cree, and my parents' first language, it's very difficult to sustain today. And so I know I think this is something we're reckoning with today in Parliament, is the intersectionality of Canada's own colonial history, Canada's own history of occupation in these lands, in combination with what is really a neoliberalism in a modern democracy, a modern liberal democracy, which is also a colonial democracy, which is also something that we're dealing with in the modern time. In 2024, we're dealing with these really important questions as we're starting to see Indigenous people take positions of power and take positions of voice, and speaking to a really difficult fact, which is we haven't been enfranchised in Canada until 1961. Like my mom could not vote in this country. That's a really serious thing we have to deal with in our own understanding of how rights can and cannot be recognized in Canada, which is forcing people to the courts. And I often see the work of the 2S LGBTQI plus community as the kind of crack in the Canadian shield that has allowed for so many other groups to enter and have their rights affirmed and recognized. Because what we've seen is this push for equality, this better understanding, this cultural change that Martine speaks about, which has now allowed this greater pursuit of diversity and inclusion, has now brought this cultural challenge to Canadians. And so in the House of Commons, for example, when I was first elected in 2021, I was the very first Two-Spirit Member of Parliament ever elected in Canada, bringing very unique perspective, not a perspective that is, I think, very commonly found within dominant Canadian society, which is this idea of coming out of the closet, that we're coming out into this society, but that we are queer and we are part of our societies. It's integral to Indigenous nationhood. It's integral to Indigenous sovereignty. It's integral to self-determination. And the closet came with colonization. We were, this idea of progress, this idea that we start at 0 and go to 100, and that's Canada's history of having no rights, and then we get to a point of having all the rights. No, Indigenous societies in North America had dealt with these questions long before colonization had approached our shores. We had equitable treatment of Indigenous Two-Spirit people. We had Indigenous Two-Spirit elders, leaders, governors, so much so that our societies were organized in matriarchies. And our challenge in our history is trying to punch through the narrative and trying to find space to speak about this very different history that we've experienced in Canada, this very different understanding of who we are. And so now we're at a time where I think that, especially when it comes to the challenges we're facing in Canada. At the very beginning, when I was elected, we had a conservative government, or sorry, conservative opposition that said we are going to put to rest the question of conversion therapy. I remember walking across the aisle and seeing Aaron O'Toole, and he said, "Blake, I know what you're going to say. You don't even have to say it. This week we're going to pass unanimous consent to ban conversion therapy. I read your letter to me. I get it. You're upset about the fact that it died on the order paper. It didn't happen last Parliament. We're going to make it happen. We're going to make this better." Imagine that, I was elated. I was like, oh my God, like this is the first week in Parliament. We're going to do it. I've seen a 180 shift where it's been so difficult and scary in Parliament now, where I'm the co-founder and co-chair of the Canadian Pride Caucus. The first time we had parliamentarians who are queer from all parties come together. And now we're really having a difficult time trying to keep ourselves together. An achievement of getting ourselves to the same space. Now we have members of the Conservatives boycotting us, boycotting our meetings, not attending, not participating. And it gives me really serious concern. And I'll end with this. We have so much more work to do. We tabled the first ever trans white paper in Parliament, a comprehensive report on how trans people in Canada deserve a kind of protection that not only looks at their well-being and their rights, but also speaks to some really important social and pragmatic and material conditions that have to be met. Access to healthcare, access to livable and affordable livelihoods, housing. We see in the streets in Canada today is an affordability crisis that is disproportionately harming trans youth. Disproportionately. Trans youth of color are on the streets at a larger rate than anyone else. And that's no secret. That's a policy choice that's happening in Canada. And so we have to be really serious about kind of the challenges that we're facing in Canada and have the courage to really meet them where they're at. It's no secret that these challenges are because of a growing sentiment. Shawn spoke about it, that existed early on in Canada's history, now turning its ugly head again and seeing vulnerable people as capital for power.
Yeah, thank you, Blake. And I think each of you, Shawn, Martine, and Blake, you've demonstrated so incredibly powerfully that when we win victories, and there have been victories. I remember the day in 2005 when same-sex marriage was finally passed by the House of Commons. It was also a very, very muggy day in Ottawa, I have to tell you. I remember standing outside with Jack Layton, and it was like pea soup out there. But but you remind us that even though we win rights through struggle, we have to be ever vigilant. This is in the present. It's not a past thing. It's an ongoing struggle. And I'd like to now bring in Fritz, because I think, just to follow up this question, because as we know, in 2017, the Governor of Canada added gender identity and expression to the Canadian human rights as in prohibited grounds of discrimination. That's very good. It was a big struggle to do that, but it happened. However, as we've seen over the past few years, especially I think more recently, anti-trans policies and negative narratives, political narratives, media narratives about trans community are seemingly on the rise. So Fritz, if I could just bring you into this now, where do you think this narrative and hate comes from, and what can we do to combat it?
Libby, could you maybe repeat the question for the benefit of the audience? Because I had trouble hearing it.
Okay. Yes. So basically the question from Robin, because I know that we kind of did a run through earlier, is just talking about Pride Month in Canada and the Pride parades that will soon be taking place across the country in cities and towns. They're very exuberant, they're diverse, and in fact, they're even commercialized, which for some people is an issue. So just really wanting to sort of get into what are the ongoing debates about who and what should be part of Pride. For example, should the police be allowed to participate? Should political views be part of Pride? So we just wanted to get your take, Charlotte, on where you think the Pride parades are at, that whole movement. It has a long history in and of itself. What's your take on it today?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a few questions that have been posed here. So let's start with the question of police. Should police be involved in Pride? Absolutely not. So I have the benefit of wearing multiple hats. So one of my hats is I work as a student at law at a firm called Prison and Police Law here in Calgary, where I'm based. And one of the things that we do there is we litigate and complain and make noise when the police commit misconduct. And what we know is that police commit misconduct all the time. And they commit misconduct all the time with the benefit of state protections. And so why is that? Because the police are an instrument of state violence, very often of the kind of settler colonial violence that has already been brought up in this conversation. We know that police over-police, over-surveil, disproportionately commit violence against Black, Indigenous, and other racialized communities. That affects queer communities too. And then, so that's the one hat I wear. The other hat I wear is that I happen to be a columnist for Rabble. I write a lot about the history of carceral politics in this country. And I think we can't forget that Pride, began really with the Stonewall riots in New York. And what were those a response to? A police raid in New York. So the police are not on the side of the 2S LGBTQ plus community. They have never been on the side of the 2S LGBTQ plus community. And so this idea that we should allow this instrument of state violence into our celebrations and into our demonstrations is kind of ridiculous to me. Now, the other kind of aspect to this question is, should their political views be a part of Pride? Well, Pride without politics isn't Pride. Pride is a political movement. Pride is a way of demonstrating and of making demands heard. So political views have always been a part of Pride. They need to be a part of Pride. And one of the things that we need to be doing as organizers within the 2S LGBTQ plus community is leveraging the popularity of Pride in order to advance the political goals of 2S LGBTQ plus people. So I remember last year I was at a party, event, for just before Pride Calgary, which a number of local and federal politicians were present. And the Conservative MP for one of the ridings downtown Calgary was in tears at being finally welcomed into Pride Calgary. And I think that's great. He wants to be part of the Pride Parade. That's wonderful. Unless the voting record of him and his party is going to support the rights and interests of 2S LGBTQ plus people, we should not be welcoming him or any other politician into our demonstrations. But the point I want to make is that politicians want to be part of this movement because it's so visible now and because it has so much cultural currency right now. We need to be leveraging that as 2S LGBTQ plus organizers to say that if you want to be with us, you need to be with us. This is a political movement. You need to be on our side. You need to be voting in a way that advances our rights and that helps our people. And we're not just going to let you in because this is just a party to which everyone is invited. So to sum up, politics absolutely should be part of Pride. Cops, not so much.
Thank you very much for that answer. And Shawn, I think you wanted to jump in here.
I wouldn't be necessarily as absolute. I don't think that uniformed police officers should march in Pride. I think that there are members of the community who are queer, who are also police officers. I understand that, this is a very divisive issue. I don't think that folks who are in their uniform should be there. I do think that we should welcome them into the parade if they're there. For example, one of the things that I always put forward in this argument is that if you're a police officer, sure, show up in a t-shirt that says police on it with rainbows or something, but it doesn't need to be the official uniform because, as has just been noted by Charlotte, the police have been historically and continue to marginalize our community, including the RCMP. I mean, something that was revealed in my documentary series is that the RCMP to this day is continuing to administratively remove gay and lesbian members from the RCMP. So like, they're not friends of the force, but there are good queer police officers across the country who I think we should welcome to Pride, but not in their uniforms. The folks in uniform are there to protect the event.
Would anybody else like to jump in on that one?
For me, it's very important, this question, because there's always two sides. I understand the past and how important it was because I'm older and I've been through it and I've been arrested, I've been through police forces and all that. But in the same time, I'm a commissioner of oath now at the Human Rights Commission of Quebec. I see all the profiling, complaint, everything. But I feel by keeping the police force away, far away from us, we're not changing them. I find we're just feeding that exclusion we're building, and they're not going to change like that. And I see a lot of police force, Canadian Army, a lot of people trying to really get closer to us for us to help them change their culture. My father always told me, keep your enemy close. Like that, you can know what they're doing and how they're doing it, and you have an impact on them. So I find it very difficult, and I have different hat right now on this conversation because I'm the president of the Purge Fund, and it really affects me to see military being rejected from Pride Parade. And at the same time, I'm with TD Bank, and we tried to help Pride since 2005. And when we did put the logo there, people were taking their money out of bank accounts. They were not putting them in. It was a big clash, and TD is still there since 19 years. So I find there's a balance and there's a conversation to have, and where we could sit down and really talk about the facts, you know, the real story, where we've been, where we are, where we want to go, how we want to do this all together. And that's the part where I come with the police. I'm not sure I would say totally no about it, and the army either. I think there's work we can do with them. And sometimes I have really good friends that are military, other good friends that are police officers. And I really like them, even if they have this role in family, and even if I was discriminated and arrested by a police officer in the past. So that part I find difficult to put a no on it.
I would just jump in there and speak a little bit from the experience of the work that we do in terms of police abolition, and just to be careful that police often come with the idea that let us work with you so that we can change fundamentally. But when you see what they're actually doing, they actually fight against fundamental change tooth and nail, especially changes to their budgets.
Yep. So unless anybody else wants to jump in and offer a comment on what you think about Pride parades and where they're at, I'd like to actually go back to Fritz, because unfortunately you did kind of get cut off. So let's try and bring you back in. And the question that we had suggested or posed to you was just to have a little bit of discussion about the trans community today and how the narrative, you know, there's seemingly a rise in hatred. It's used by the political right as a divisive issue to divide people. So just, you know, wondering if you can reflect a little bit about where does this hate come from and what can we do to combat it?
I think I mentioned before I cut off that we are still in a state of colonialism. Right?
Yes.
We are still colonized within our mindset, what it means to be trans, what it means to be queer. We are still operating dominantly from a binary perspective of gender, from cis heteronormativity, from heteropatriarchy. Patriarchy is very much shaping our institutional structures in different ways, and that continue to shapes our mindset, perpetuating, defending heteronormativity, defending whiteness at all fronts, at different levels, just to maintain that dominant power and status quo of dominant groups identifying with this dominant structure. So, so we are still not. So we are still continuing to fight for liberation from this colonial mindset. And I think that hate is also shaping and perpetuating is the effect of this colonial mindset. right? How the state deal with difference has a history, has a long history in which, you know, queer and trans bodies have been treated by the medical system, by political system, of course, with all the history, by educational system. So I think we need to continue to be mindful that yes, we are still in the state of colonialism, and that hate continues, right? But our resistance also continues. The other side of it too is that hate, when I think about it more deeply as well, it is often kind of, um, you know, imagine that there is something that is being lost when we fight for trans liberation. Something is lost from normative subjects or citizen subjects. Something is being taken away from heteronormative and cisgender folks when we fight for trans liberation. But that is a fallacy, right? That is like a wrong mindset. And that's, again, still part of a colonial mindset. Nothing has been taken away from cisnormative, cisgender, and heteronormative folks. Like, we are, as much as we are fighting for trans liberation, we are actually, you know, trying to liberate ourselves from this colonial mentality altogether, right?
Mhm.
And so my response to the second question in terms of how we combat it is through coalition building. We should continue our resistance. Maybe our resistance is not necessarily within the nation state. We can also have our own collective resistance. I still believe in the power of the arts, on how we can retrain and educate our mindset, our cultural imagination to reimagine and empower people to raise that critical consciousness raising. I still believe, or we still need to be reminded by the women of color, the Black feminists who are foregrounding intersectionality perspective, that our movement today has to be intersectional. It's not just about a fight for queer and trans issues, but also of race and other you know, markers of difference, including disability justice perspective. So, and also we need to make sure that we are supporting the already existing efforts of queer and trans communities who are helping each other, who become carers of their own community because the nation state doesn't care for them, right? So we need to actually continue to make pressure um, together collectively to pressure the state to support our struggles, to support our collective efforts. Um, yeah, and then our educational system continue to be, you know, integrated out there. So I'm an educator. I continue to bring in queer and trans histories in the curriculum, educating future social workers to increase the competence in regards to queer and trans work. So I think we can do this collectively. So combating this issue should be done collectively at different levels, using our own, you know, contexts, different context roles, maybe people from the government, and also people who are outside of political institutions. Yeah, and I think you know, that is something that we continue to you know, make efforts fighting towards you know, liberation. So
Thank you for that, Fritz, because you've given a very great segue to our next question, which we're going to open up to everybody. And that is, how connected are queer rights linked with other human rights movements? So how linked are they with other human rights movements? What more can be done to promote inclusivity in the LGBTQ community? So we're going to, anybody who wants to jump in on that one, go ahead.
Well, I would like to jump on this one because I think there's a lot of things we can do. And after Fritz just talked, I just want to say there's a lot of great things we can do. Just like me, I did some internship for trans people in the work, and now we all hire them full time. So that's another way to do really position for people that are from the trans community. They can even come before doing the transition and we'll support them during transition. So there's a lot of projects like that as well. You see always the TD thing and the Pride, but it's bigger than that. I was able to help clinic in Montreal for doctor that helps youth that has non-binary and trans, like Clinic Meraki. I was able to help Creative Kids, all those organizations. And I think that's exactly a responsibility of even the corporation and all the private sector to jump in and help out and be part of hiring the talent, be part of giving grant and money to clinic or doctor or organization that are there to help. And I think that brings a connection to what's happening with the queer. There's so much we can do and so much is being done that would be interesting to be able to share more all those initiatives that we're trying to put in place to change the narrative. And because it is really hard for youth right now, and I totally agree with what Fritz is saying and how hard it is to be a young person in Alberta or in New Brunswick right now, but even in Quebec. And in Quebec, there's a lot of things they're putting in place to put roadblock about it. And even they did a TV show. So for me, and I know because I'm with the private sector, I'm fighting for that, but it's bigger than that. I believe in it because I was in the Pride when Pride was supported by cigarette company and beer company and bars. Okay. I was there when we had no money to do nothing. So there's a balance to get. And I think today there is some corporation out there, organization, private, that are ready to really be there and help the community at large. And I know I talk from being a white lesbian, and I know I'm privileged, but I did suffer of discrimination in the past. But I am considerate of what's happening around me and how can I help? Because I have a responsibility. So that's how I see our connection to it and how I'm trying to help.
Yeah, thank you, Martine. Charlotte and Blake, did you want to weigh in on this one? How connected are queer rights with other human rights movements, and what more can be done to promote inclusivity in the LGBTQ community?
Blake, do you want to go?
Sure. So I think it's fundamental. It's kind of like the tip of the iceberg in my mind of what has been a human struggle for a very long time. And many societies, particularly pre-colonialism, had to struggle with those very same realities across the globe. And some nations and some groups have come to different conclusions than others, but through the domination of the rise of the British Empire, largely more recently, it's set the world back, I think, in a very significant way for our united struggle with the advent of racism. You know, when I say racism, there's often a misconception as to what racism is, and I often find myself as a person who speaks about racism often, I have to define it in order for us to have a common place for it. That doesn't mean discrimination based on who one is. It is a structure. Racism is a structure, a hierarchy that says that particularly Europeans, those of European descent, are here, and everyone else is classified at lower positions. That framework is a dominant framework. And so when we think about the question of human rights movements, the question of liberation is the same, you know, but we got to challenge the structure that has created the oppressive conditions that we all suffer. The 2S LGBTQI community is part of a racist structure. You know, it lives somewhere down here. You know, when we think about how racism with, you know, the intersection of the scientific method, which is how racism became a predominantly scientific theory that gained widespread and global domination as to why particularly Caucasians of European descent were able to dominate such a great vast amount of 80% of the globe. And we often never pause to think, oh, you know, we're living a really remarkable time in global history where one small island was able to dominate 80% of the globe. 80% of the globe. We have to think about that, for example. We really have to consciously be aware of what that means. Those impacts are vast, they're extreme, and they're domineering. And so when we think about human struggle across the globe, we have to think about how human struggle has manifested. Human struggle is largely manifested because of these institutions that were placed on all people, including Europeans, Europeans that did not have access to material wealth, that became property, just like so many others. When I think about my Scottish colleagues, for example, they often share with me how they get to Canada. The Irish colleagues have how they got to Ireland, and more recently, Syrians and other groups. The conditions often the same, one group dominating another. And that, I think, is the most important human struggle that can unite all of us, is that we are united in our opposition to these structures that continue to compartmentalize all of us, that continue to separate all of us, that continue to tell us one group is better than the other group or is more deserving of another group. And I'll end with this. There's a story I grew up as a child. They call it the journey to the lake story. It's when young children like me, when I was growing up, I struggled with, particularly growing up in a Métis reserve, a small community of just Métis people reserved in Alberta, adjacent to a federal reserve. I asked many times, why is it that I don't have clean water? Why do I have so little? Why am I so materially poor? And if you go 40 minutes outside this community, there's a white community that has everything. They have a school, they got a pool, they got a store, they got a grocery store. We have none of it. Why is it that I can't even get clean water in my own house? And it made me upset. My elder looked at me, he laughed. He said, Blake, listen, come here. And he told me a story about what journey we're all going to. He said, imagine a lake. And imagine that lake is filled with everything all humans need. Everything that every living spirit needs. Not just humans, all life. Imagine it. And now imagine how one gets there. Imagine how a deer gets to that lake. And I said, well, yeah, the deer hops, goes through the forest and he gets to the lake. He said, okay, now what about a seagull? I said, well, it flies. Now what about a bug that's going to crawl? What about a human? Well, they're going to journey their way there just the same, and it's going to be unique to them. Everyone starts, every living organism, every spirit needs that same life, that same force, that same spirit, that same thing to nourish all of us. We have to find ways to respect each other's journey towards it. And when we respect each other's journey towards that truth, to what Fritz is saying, that is a decolonial mindset that he was offering me, that elder was offering me a way out of the trap that the system has put us in. When we operate in the colonial mindset, it creates paradoxes and it creates juxtaposition and it creates contradiction because it was meant to. If we can unwrap ourselves from that and remember that we are all deserving of love, we are all deserving of the very basic living dignity that our Creator has given us, and our journeys towards that thing that feeds all of us is one that needs to be respected, then I think we're on a better path to answering the question of how our human struggle is connected.
Thank you, Blake. Charlotte, did you want to have the last word on this question?
Yeah, I think Blake has said so eloquently, has answered so eloquently the question about the connection between queer rights and other human rights movements. I want to speak a bit to the question of promoting inclusivity within 2S LGBTQ plus settings. And I want to say a couple of things here. But to begin, I think it's important not to fetishize inclusivity. I think there is a tendency to say, oh, well, the goal is to include everyone. But I'm not actually convinced that is the goal of, the 2S LGBTQ movement. The goal is to create space for people who have been violently, historically and in the present, violently ejected from dominant spaces, have been violently prevented from entering dominant spaces. And so the goal is to carve out inclusive spaces for us. It's not necessarily to welcome everyone and everything under the queer umbrella. And so I don't think we want inclusivity for its own sake, because there are people in this world who want to hurt us, who wish us harm, who I don't think we should be welcoming with open arms into our house. That said, it is the case that that within the 2S LGBTQ plus community, there is exclusion and rejection, often on racial lines, often on lines of ableism, so discrimination against people with disability, and other axes of oppression that queer people are guilty of. And so we need to identify what has been excluded, who has been excluded, and why, both historically and in the present. And we need to interrogate those exclusions and ask ourselves, okay, so it's one thing to say we don't want this person here because, we don't want Danielle Smith, for instance, I'll just name a name, marching in our Pride Parade because she actively, is doing things to put trans youth lives at risk. But why is it that our, queer space is not accessible to, say, people who explored a gender identity but decided that, say, they didn't in fact want to transition? Why are, for instance, like detransitioners so excluded and so marginalized within 2S LGBTQ plus spaces? That's transphobic in its own way. And so we need to be and you could go on and create this long litany of exclusions, and you need to interrogate every single one of them, because the goal is not to include everyone and everything. The goal is to create inclusivity for, as I said, those of us who have been so violently excluded, and in the end to build a juster and more humane world.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Charlotte. Honestly, this is just a great discussion. I think we really appreciate the amazing perspectives that you're beginning. And we are getting questions coming in from the audience. So I just want to jump in and take on one question that came in. And it's basically, the question is, what is the reaction when Pierre Poilievre or other conservative leaders like Doug Ford or Danielle Smith express transphobic or homophobic rhetoric, but openly gay conservative MPs like Eric Duncan or Melissa Lantsman remain silent? So I'm going to ask actually Blake and Shawn to jump in on this one, because I think you can give kind of a view from inside the house from Blake and a view from outside the house from Shawn. So, what's your reaction to that when members of the queer community actually, are confronted with their own party homophobia and transphobia, and where are they at? So any reactions you've got to that, Blake, and then Shawn?
That's a loaded question. I mean, if we're talking about the Conservative Party in particular, I mean, they've had policies that have been wildly swinging all over the place since about 2015. I mean, let's not forget, in 2015 they actually did have a policy that was supported by their members that was in favor of same-sex marriage. But then as soon as they changed their leader again, everything switched. I'm just concerned that queer MPs in the House who would not be supporting the entire queer community I'm concerned that they would have the nerve to show up and be at a Pride event when part of the Pride that we're there to protect is a group they don't support. I would hope that members of Parliament who support trans kids, I mean, part of the problem with all of this discussion is we can't have a normal discussion about young people. They've got the charter of the kids' charter. I think they just announced today in Alberta or yesterday, and like, no one's talking about the fact that gay adults, all of us here who are queer in this gathering today, were once children. I knew that I was a gay boy when I was 9 years old. So let's start talking about that. Let's start talking about how gay adults were once young children who were also queer children. We need to start talking about those kids' rights to recognize that they are growing up completely normal. It is normal to be 10-year-old and trans. It is completely normal to be questioning your gender identity and questioning all of that stuff, because that's what you do at that age. And so sexualizing things and twisting the argument and having trans exclusionary, feminists going up in arms and things, it really outrages me. And I just wish that we could focus on making our politicians recognize that the policies have to protect everyone, and that by targeting trans kids, literally the smallest slice, the biggest, the tiniest slice of our community are these kids, and they're doing the most harm to them. Putting them in the political arena, I don't think is fair, and I think politicians should take those kids and their policies and rethink a few things. I apologize for going off in so many directions there, but I'm so worked up on this subject.
No, it's what we love to hear, I'll tell you. So Blake, just if you'd like to weigh in on that question as well, do you want me to repeat it, or you kind of got the gist of it?
Yeah, I think it really does come down to power. It's about power. It's simply about power. How it's an equation. It's a mathematical problem that the Conservatives have invented in order to elicit the most amount of power for the best bang for their buck. And they would target, and they've historically targeted two members of the 2S LGBTQI community. They've historically targeted Black and Indigenous people. They've historically targeted women. They've historically targeted groups of people for a very real reason, which is this perceived notion. And I can't remember who said it earlier. I think it was maybe Fritz. This notion that they have something to protect, that they are at threat. And when they say they have a very good understanding of who the dominant group is in Canada, who has power. There's this perception of those who have power, which is usually cis heteronormative men that have, for the most part of our country's history, have formed a power block. And that power block has been protected. Look at the language we use, the founding fathers of Canada, right? They're all men of the same background, of the same religion, of the same exact backgrounds. They're from the same place, Europe. They've created a political system that was meant to benefit them. It was designed and created to benefit them. And so now what we see is this, our democracy is transformed in such a way where we have done the work, groups and communities have done the work to say, hey, listen, we need to redefine the social contract. We belong in this place. We belong in our country. We belong, no matter who you are, where you live, how much you make, we belong in this place. This is us. We're not going anywhere. And I think what the Conservatives have done largely is try to revert whenever they feel they can seize power. They revert to this position of let's create a culture war, divide the masses, and we will galvanize the votes and we'll form a majority government. That's for the very illicit purpose of power. They punch down in order for them to move up. To be really plain and simple about it.
If I could jump in too, Blake, what you were saying, sorry, but the division, like they're really good at dividing us as a community. And we're talking, I believe this question started off with the intersectionality of a bunch of different communities. They're keeping us all separate. They're keeping the Islamic community angry at the queer community because they think we're grooming their kids. They're keeping everybody, Christians, mad at drag queens. They're really good at putting wedges into everybody. And if we could all just sort of deal first with gay white privilege in our community, that would sort a lot of things out. And then also just respect one another.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need
we
to
fundamentally want the same thing.
Yeah, we don't need to understand each other. We just need to respect one another. Sorry.
Yeah, and I agree. Fundamentally, if we're going to have a social contract that protects individuals, if we're going to have a social contract that protects communities, it has to be the same for everyone. And the Conservatives, I think this is their last ditch effort to hold on to a kind of power and a kind of perception that they know will disadvantage their political movements, which is why there's such illicit financing internationally by evangelical Americans in particular. It's no secret that the laws in the Congo, the laws in Uganda are the way they are. It's because there's a very pernicious and malicious intent to find ways to do the same thing but elsewhere. And we here in Canada, it's known as settler colonialism, but in this particular instance, it's colonialism directly. It's a state using its resources and its power to ensure that a democratic process like that in Uganda could be so grossly manipulated that our ideals become, or their ideals and the evangelical ideals become the ideals of that state in order to try to create a cultural block and cultural unity. And so this issue is not just domestic, it's international. That's why we have to see this as a human rights issue across the board. This is fundamentally about how we treat humans, how we treat humanity, and how that contract needs to be updated significantly, because what the purpose of our country serves today is to protect some but not everyone, which speaks to the very first question we asked today, why the courts have become the only body that has largely been able to uphold what is fundamental rights of people in our country at the absence of politicians.
All right. Fantastic discussion. We're getting to the end. We have one last audience question that we're going to ask, because it relates to some stuff we've touched on already. So we're going to direct this to Martine and Fritz to have the last words. Here's the question. With pride parades banning Canadian Force members, how can they call themselves inclusive if they are banning members of the 2S LGBTQIA plus community and allies? So we'll do Martine and then Fritz. You can end us and then we'll wrap up.
Very short answers, please.
I think I did bring that earlier. I don't think we should not allow military or anyone. We should not exclude anyone from the Pride Parade. I think we should work with those people. And if we think they're not inclusive, we should work with them to make them inclusive. That's for me, because to just say that's the way they are and they're never going to change, I find that I don't see it as a solution. And I'm really saying that not because I don't think they don't profile or there's no violence or anything like that. And I want to bring something back. There was some discrimination at IBM. There was discrimination at TD. There was discrimination in all companies. There was some good manager and there was some bad manager. So to say there's only the police force that are acting this way would be wrong, because there are other, and we just talked about it, a lot of politicians are acting that way too. So for me, it's really, how can I work with them to change them? And this is why even with the Purge Fund, I did that big investigation on all federal agencies, and we did emerging from the Purge report with really clear recommendations. For me, that was the solution. Let's bring solution, because we can change people. That's the way I see it. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Martine. And Fritz, just very quickly, if you want to add a few words, because then we're going to wrap up.
And I think we should make sure we have a clear understanding what inclusivity means. What does it mean to be inclusive? What does it mean to be an ally? If you are included as an ally, you have a responsibility. It's not just for the purpose of representation or visibility out there that we are all celebrating, oh, happy-go-lucky, we are having pride, you are now coming. You have a responsibility as an ally in uniform, as a gay or allies in uniform. Is this what the question is trying to make? But until we see they're doing their work, they're doing their responsibility for the queer and trans community, then it is also even not up to us. They should also decide on themselves how they should position their relationship with the queer and trans community. That should be our decision and our honest that, oh, we have to be inclusive as an LGBTQ. Like, these allies should have their own mindset too on how they would position and be mindful of the historical relations that they have with queer and trans community. So I end there. Thank you.
That's fantastic. I think it's called accountability, and I think it's a very fine point to end on. So that is all the time that we have today, folks, for our audience questions. And I just want to say a huge thank you to our guests today. You've all been just fantastic. I feel like we covered a lot of ground and a lot of different perspectives. So thank you to Fritz and Charlotte, Blake, Shawn, and Martine for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Just to our audience, our live political panel Off the Hill will return not until September. We'll be on a summer hiatus until then. But however, if you have suggestions for what our political panel should be in September, please get in touch with us. You can email Browne, which is editor@rabble.ca, or over social media. We would welcome any suggestions you have for September. And of course, over the summer, be sure not to miss a single Rabble update by signing up for Rabble's newsletter at rabble.ca/subscribe. Well, I want to end before we go on our summer break by thanking Rabble for hosting events like this. You know, Rabble has just launched its summer fundraiser, so we hope that everybody, your friends, your neighbors, will consider supporting rabble.ca. Become a monthly donor, rabble.ca/donate. It's what keeps Rabble going. They need to have that support from the community. That's also accountability that we talked about. So thank you so much to everyone this evening and this afternoon if you're on the West Coast like me. And we'll see you again in September.
Bye, everybody.